Help MythVision keep bringing you material by becoming a Patreon member, as well as PayPal. Like, share, subscribe, and comment. Join the Patreon to get early access to videos and check out the website. We are MythVision. Welcome back to MythVision Podcast. Your host, Derek Lambert. We're going to be talking about the history of Mythicism. We've already had part one with Christopher Hansen, and you've done a fantastic job describing a lot of the history that took place with Mythicism. It sounded like it was like a predominant or even a majority position for skeptics, at least, during certain times in our history. And of course, I love what you do, and the reason why is it shows that with new information, we should always consider it and move forward in our knowledge. And I am not a mythicist. I say that up front. I am agnostic on the Jesus question, seeing very good reason why there may have been, and seeing good reason why a lot of it's myth, and how to know is very confusing depending on the methodology you use and all sorts of stuff. So it's an interesting question I like to journey into. Our first part, we were way back in black and white TV days. Before that, okay, before TV existed. We're getting into the 20th century here, and you've done a little bit of that last time. So can you recap what we've discussed and what we may be talking about today? Christopher Hansen, by the way, if you don't mind mentioning your book that's coming and a little bit about you for our audience.
Yep. So hi, everybody. For those that don't know, I am Chris Hansen. I am an activist, and I'm also primarily in my scholarly stuff working on the history of mythicism, and also trying to create a more conducive platform for having actual debate on whether or not Jesus existed. My book has been recently accepted. It's been accepted at Wittgenstock. It's going to be entitled The Quest of the Mythical Jesus. And so basically it will hopefully be out in the next year or a year and a half. So
the quest of the mythical Jesus.
Yep.
Oh, look.
I'm calling back to Albert Schweitzer. He had the quest of the historical Jesus. Mine is the quest of the mythical Jesus.
I know you did this on purpose. I mean, you knew you were going to catch some crap from people. You're making kind of a pun there for anybody who doesn't understand. Like, you're saying we got to look for the mythical Jesus technically, because you're suggesting there's a historical Jesus mainly.
Yeah, it's specifically a pun on the work of Albert Schweitzer. Albert Schweitzer wrote what is one of the most quintessential tomes of historical Jesus scholarship back in the early 1900s, and I think we talked about it briefly because he was actually part of the mythicist debate as well. But he wrote The Quest of the Historical Jesus, and it was an absolutely seminal work, and it is still at least called back to by academics today. Like, his central thesis of an apocalyptic Jesus is still held by academics like Bart Ehrman. So it is. I decided because his work was very focused on going through different presentations of Jesus in historical literature. Since I'm doing a similar thing, I'm going to pun off of his title. So we are now entertaining the quest of the mythical Jesus. And so I think last time we did talk about I think mythicism in the Soviet Union, right? And we talked about the Arthur Dreves controversy, and so we're starting to move into modern times then. So just as a brief recap, at the dawn of the 20th century, in Germany specifically, there started probably the largest debate on whether Jesus existed or not in history. It was primarily sparked by Albert Kalthoff, who was a pastor actually in Germany. He was at Saint Miranda. I can't remember this exact place. He joined the German Monist League, and the German Monist League facilitated a lot of this. And then Arthur Dreves wrote Die Christusmythe in 1909. It is probably to this day the best-selling mythicist book ever written. It was something that influenced basically the entire world of mythicism. It was translated into, at this point it's been probably translated into more than a dozen languages. It was, in that day, it was translated into Japanese, Russian, French, English, Spanish, and more. It influenced debates that happened in India. It influenced Kotoko Shutsui in Japan. It also is then what sparked the acceptance of mythicism in the Soviet Union. Vladimir Lenin, in his article on the significance of militant materialism, argued that basically if we were going to take out religion, we should ally ourselves with people like Arthur Dreves, who are so instrumental in destroying like the Christian faith that way. During this time, it's also worth noting that most proponents of mythicism, particularly in Germany and Russia, usually were anti-religious in some way, or at least anti-Christian. Arthur Dreves thought that Christianity, for example, was like an impedance on science and on culture, and so he wanted to create a new religion. He had an idealistic monism. He basically created a new religion to replace Christianity. Vladimir Lenin saw Drevs's religion as ridiculous and said that needed to be wiped out too. Just wipe out all religion, but we'll use Arthur Drevs's work to take out Christianity while we're at it. And so that's basically how it became the majority position in the USSR, which was staunchly anti-religious and especially anti-Christian. With the vast majority of its members, the leading mythicists in academia in the Soviet Union, usually being a part of like the Godless Militant League, part of atheist. There was an atheist museum that Yosef Krivlev was part of. Sergei Kovalev was head of atheist movements and stuff like that. So most of these historians of the Bible were usually also associated with ardent anti-religious activism in some way. Towards the 1950s, then the Khrushchev thaw happens. That was basically a policy that was starting to open things up a little bit. And then Archibald Robertson's book, The Origin of Christianity, was translated into Russian. And that basically started a complete downward trend for mythicism, because Archibald Robertson's book was a Marxist analysis of early Christianity from the perspective that Jesus existed. And so it demonstrated that Marxist academics did not actually have to require Jesus not exist. And it sparked a massive debate. And in a Russian journal in the 1960s, there was hosted a specialized issue of it, all on whether or not Jesus existed. And basically, coming out of the 1960s, almost every single Marxist academic, including all the most of all the Bible academics in the Soviet Union, came to the conclusion either that Jesus existed or that the issue wasn't important, and so they didn't even bother talking about it anymore. And by the 1980s, Yosef Krivlev was basically the last mythicist in Russian academia. And by the 90s, he died the year that the Soviet Union collapsed, if I remember correctly. And with that, basically all mythicists in academia were gone, and Russian academia, to my knowledge, is now all historicists. Now, what we didn't get into last time was then a parallel development actually in China. So this is where we're going to step into more of the modern time frame. So right now we're now pushing into the 1970s. I'm going to focus on China first, but we have to remember, when I go back parallel to what's going on in China, there are other developments, specifically in England, that are really important, and also in Germany. So in China, after the Communist Party won out basically after World War II, and Mao Zedong took over. Religious studies in particular became extremely censored in China. And one thing that became basically a mainstay was the promotion of the idea that Jesus did not exist. This was actually influenced a lot by the work of Kotoku Shutsui out of Japan. For those that are unaware, Kotoku Shutsui was an anarchist in Japan. He was trying to basically fight against the imperial regime, against the emperor and everything. And he wrote a book called On the Obliteration of Christ, which was published after his death in 1911. He died because he was falsely implicated in a plot to assassinate the emperor and then executed for it. And then the book came out after that. Almost all of Kotoku's work was actually censored, but this one actually somehow got through the censors, even though basically the reason he argued against Jesus' existence was he used it also as a metaphor to argue that basically it was very anti-emperor. So it's really odd that that managed to actually make it through the censorship, but it did. And then from that time, there were a number of Chinese academics also that were visiting in Japan. And a few of them, one of them we don't know for certain because the first translation of his work into Chinese is anonymous. It's cited under a pseudonym. So basically what ends up happening is that it's brought into Japan in the 1920s and translated into Mandarin. And then simultaneously, Zhu Jixin uses it to basically argue that Jesus was a liar and deceived everyone. This further developed basically from about 1945 to 1948 onward, it was the mainstay in Chinese academia to teach people that Jesus did not exist, and that was basically the end of it, and there wasn't really any debate on it. Archibald Robertson's work was translated into Mandarin shortly after it was published in the 1950s, but it actually didn't make much of any impact there. In fact, according to Wang Xiaochao, in this book, The Chinese Face of Jesus Christ, Volume 3b, and also I apologize to all people because I've tried to learn the pronunciations, but
don't worry, we're not going to crucify you, I promise.
Yeah, but anyways, he basically notes that he couldn't find a single rebuttal to Robertson's work in Chinese academics at all. It just made like almost no impact, surprisingly. So the exact opposite of what happened in the USSR. But what actually ended up happening is, so in the late 1970s, what happened was called the open door policy. And this policy opened up, first started opening up things like trade and economics, and then also started opening up academics a little bit more. And so within a few years, there was a journal that was started on in academia that was approved for the studying the history of Christianity, for the study of religion, and a bunch of other stuff. And so this began actually a whole series of debates that really start in the late 70s and early 80s. So in 1981, Hu Yutong publishes a paper on the arguing that Jesus existed, and he argues it primarily based on the idea that it just seemed absurd that the Gospels, the Epistles, and then also some extra biblical sources all seem to have this idea that there was a person, Jesus, and that it somehow was just all made up. But then 2 years later, Yin Changyu published another article in the same journal entitled Jesus, a Legendary and Unhistorical Figure. And he basically argued on the premise of silence that Jesus never existed. So he argued that Josephus never wrote about Jesus, and that was an interpolation. Oddly enough, he didn't do it actually based on the language Josephus used, but on the fact that he had noticed that Josephus considered Vespasian the Messiah. And so he's like, why would he write that about Jesus being the Messiah when he thought that Vespasian was? so he didn't. He never wrote that. So it was actually for me that's a really intriguing argument. But then he also argues that we can't date the Gospels, so they can't be used as any solid evidence. And so basically argues that because we have no sources that can adequately attest to Jesus, that he didn't exist. What ended up shifting actually it is towards the end of the 80s and then into the 90s. Actually, what was a very particularly influential work, again according to Zhao Chao, is actually the work of John Dominic Crossan. John Dominic Crossan published a book, Jesus, a Revolutionary Biography, in the early 90s, and it was translated into Mandarin, and it had a huge impact, primarily because it was not clearly apologetical, so it was not like clearly with a Christian bias to it, and was also taken from a sociological standpoint. And so Chinese academics really took to that work. And then another Chinese academic who was very influential was Tang Yi. And he published a book on the history of Christianity and also argued that Jesus existed in it. So by the 1990s, Chinese academics also started dropping mythicism. And today I can't find anything past the 2000s that really attests to Chinese academics using it any longer.
This brings up a great question, I think, that's necessary. I love when you are telling us the history, and what I really loved about last episode, including what you're already doing so far, is as you're telling us like scholarship in these particular places in the world, how they changed from mythicist to historicist or historicist to mythicist. You kind of give a little bit of the details as to like what their argument was, and you're not even coming through bias. That's one thing I really appreciate in this, what you're doing right now. Even though you have a position, and in fact you would openly say I'm biased, you're saying this is what they said. And I love that about you and what you're doing here. You're teaching something amazing. My question would be this: we started finding some stuff, and I know this is kind of pausing the timeline on pushing into contemporary because we're going to get there, but with the discovery of the Nag Hammadi text, discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, like further research into knowing some of the stuff that was going on in the first century, BC 80 or BCE, and then Common Era, CE, and onward, we found out more than what we knew in the 1800s. Let's just put it that way. Is there any arguments that the scholars are using at this point to say, hey, okay, this helps the weight of an apocalyptic teacher? Why would they have invented in full fiction when we have evidence of guys like it? Kind of like we can go to the book of Acts and we could say, look, he looks like Theodus, the Egyptian. Like, it's another movement like that, but it survived the war, so we keep it around. And those are good arguments, by the way, which I find compelling. And this is why I cannot say I'm staunch mythicist. No, I'm not. I'm agnostic because I don't have all the information and I'm not as well read. And eventually I plan to take a position if the evidence leads me there. And I can entertain a historical Jesus all day long. I just did a Dave Allen video, loved his theory, his idea. Was there a negative testimony of Flavinium? Like, was there something there that wasn't in positive light of a character that might have been Jesus? I don't know. It's interesting. So I just say that to say, was there anything, before we move on, was there like archaeological evidence? Was there more evidence we didn't have that really mythicism couldn't survive in an academic world the way it did in the 1800s, for so to speak, because there was more weight brought to the table in a different respect that made them think, hey, there was a guy, and there's more likely there was a guy than there wasn't, and here's why?
Yeah, so in Chinese academics, I can't see that was a huge factor in it as much. It was the case with a lot of Chinese academics that actually a lot of them did not speak a lot of the languages uh of the ancient Christians that much, so they aren't always working from a lot of primary sources directly. A lot of times they're working either from translated sources or translations of translations and stuff like that. Um, but that has been definitely changing quite a lot recently. Um, but it was definitely the case in Russian academics, especially it was actually the Dead Sea Scrolls in particular that changed a lot of understanding about early Christianity. The Dead Sea Scrolls were very quickly grabbed on by Soviet academics. Before that, when discussing Christianity, basically everything that they wanted to know about Christianity was basically to be found in this book by Abram Ravanovic. It is basically it is the sources of early Christian history, and it was primarily all Greco-Roman sources, and then also the New Testament sources and stuff like that. They didn't have a whole lot outside of that yet. When the Dead Sea Scrolls began being published in Russia, it became a huge thing. And then also it really influenced the way that they characterized early Christianity and thought about how early Christianity developed, because it made it seem more plausible that a person could have started it in this way because they had now a whole lot more background information. Another thing that really changed their positions, and actually in the second edition of this book, which is what I have, um, uh, they ended up when more data was published specifically on the Testimonium Flavianum, a lot of them changed their positions as well. For those unaware, in the 1970s, Shlomo Pines published a small book on the Syriac fragments and Arabic fragments he had found of the Testimonium in other writers' works, like Agapius. And so in those works, basically it was presented a testimonium that didn't have all of the clear interpolations that we do in the Greek, in the Textus Receptus. And so that was latched on by Russian academics as well, really hard. And the historicists were like, see, y'all were just wrong. The partial authenticity thing was right. And so, for example, there's a passage on it in an appendix here by Irina Svenskoy. And then that's only been further aided by the discovery of some different Latin recensions of the Testimonium, which don't have the really forceful language either. For example, in one of the recensions by Rufinus, I think, is a reading that is "he was believed to be the Christ" instead of "he was the Christ." So there's a lot more that's been discovered out there, and Russian academics really latched onto that, and so that really also helped influence their positions.
I was going to ask you about that specifically. He was believed to be like, so the consensus, I need to ask because I'm not brought up on the consensus. Some of the mythicist friends of mine that are scholars in this field will say, look, it's hard to make good evidence out of bad evidence, right? So it's almost like you remember the O.J. Simpson case when the guy, the FBI agent, had the blood. Come on, they had DNA, they had evidence to prove he was guilty, yet they had to throw it out because the guy didn't go through the proper procedures when he was actually taking this evidence against O.J. Simpson. Well, they're kind of making that argument like, well, this is bad evidence, so how can you make good evidence? But when you take a magnifying glass to this thing, is it your opinion and the consensus opinion that, listen, there's probably something that was here? This isn't an ex nihilo interpolation. I don't want to get caught up on this because I know you're trying to get into the history, but I think this plays a part to some degree if they're talking about a guy. I mean, the argument is used by Christians. They have a hard time arguing with mythicists because, well, look at what it says. It's obvious Josephus didn't really think that. And there's evidence maybe that it comes from a Lucan type gospel. Maybe Eusebius did interpolate this. But what are your thoughts? Like, quickly, if you don't mind.
So, my position, I'm going to actually be real. My position is that I think it's interpolated entirely.
Completely. Okay.
I think that the James Brother of Jesus passage is probably as well. I'm perfectly willing to change my mind on it. But right now I think that they're interpolated. But if I was to actually posit that they were, that there was like a core to them in some way, I actually still don't consider them good evidence either. I actually agree with mythicists on this. And the reason I do is because let's just say that it was authentic in some way. We have no idea what it said. all the reconstructions are hypothetical. And so my problem is that I don't think you can actually gain solid evidence from a hypothetical source. This is one of my major criticisms of Bart Ehrman's book. So he appeals to sources like Q and M and L, but we don't actually have any Q, M, or L. These are reconstructions and they're hypothetical. Yeah. And so I don't think you can base evidence of the historical Jesus on a hypothetical reconstruction. Even if it seems like a solid reconstruction, I don't think you can, because I don't think you can epistemologically get there. And there's one more problem that's actually even worse than in the case of Q. When we look at the testimonium, and I'll be done after this, but basically when we look at the testimonium and the fact that it's hypothetical, we also then have no idea where the information came from. And so it could be that he got this information from Christians. Could be that he had another source and got it from a Jewish source on Jesus, but we have no idea where it came from. And so we're basically left in this state of, even if it did exist, it's a hypothetical reconstruction. So we can't really argue that we know anything about Jesus from it. And even if we had a solid reconstruction of it that we could all agree on, we still don't know where it came from, where that information stemmed from.
Well, thank you for taking the time to. It's interesting because I think, I'm learning, and I think that's an interesting topic to look into. But anyway, I stopped you. I'm going to go back to full screen view, and it's back on you, brother. Just take us off. But I figured the Dead Sea Scrolls played a part, and that's why I asked. And I'm sure there's more to it. When they analyze the linguistics, they start considering things. They probably said, you know what? Okay, I think this fits more of a historicist position in their view. And I'd like to get, of course, into contemporary times and stuff like that as we go too. So. Yep.
Okay, so I'm going to step back just a little bit. We're going to go back into the 1960s again now. So in the 1960s, we do have some more mythicist work coming up. In New Zealand, there's a writer named Patrick Campbell who wrote a pamphlet called The Mythical Jesus or something like that. In New Zealand, he was. I can't find much information on him, but I know that the work went through a number of editions. The latest one I found, I think, was a third edition of the work in the late 1960s. So we know that it was present there. We know it was present in Australia. There are works that were being printed, like small pamphlets and stuff, in the United States by secularist presses trying to push out mythicism, but it basically had no academic acceptance, but academics were actually still responding to it. It wasn't that they were like completely ignored. By far, they were not like handled with much care, but like you could still find like short chapters on them and stuff like that. Coming into the 1970s, though, this starts to really change big time. So the early 1970s, we have 3 authors, 2 in England and 1 in Germany, all publishing simultaneously, for the most part, on whether or not Jesus existed. And these are John M. Allegro, the G.A. Wells, and Rudolf Augstein in Germany. So I'll start with John Allegro. Allegro was actually one of the most famous Dead Sea Scrolls scholars ever. You can find pictures of him smoking over the scrolls. They will make you cringe. Trust me, those early scholars will make you cringe in those photos. They're sitting there, cigarette smoke over these 2,000-year-old artifacts, and you're just like,
wow.
It was a different time. But Allegro basically, he'd been coming off of a couple controversies. So he had come off like the Copper Scroll controversy, and I won't get into that, but there's you can read about it elsewhere. And he was criticized quite frequently for not citing everything properly and making it hard to find stuff in his published work. But then in the 1970s, he got really into Sumeriology, and then also the Dead Sea Scrolls, and he got into this realm of conjectural linguistics. Basically, he came to the conclusion that Jesus did not exist, but that he was a mushroom hallucination by a cult of clandestine worshippers who would ingest hallucinogenics and then have these hallucinogen visions of Jesus. It was not based on much of solid evidence. A lot of it was based off of these really conjectural readings of things in the Dead Sea Scrolls and the New Testament, based on these speculative and often just made up etymologies and readings from Sumerian. For example, using Sumerian to get the idea that Jesus's name means semen that saves. Yes.
What? That's crazy.
Yep.
Okay. Yeah, and look, I just want to say for anybody watching, like, I'm not against the idea that there are potential locations of the early church that might have potentially ingested things that might have made them see things like a shamanistic sense. I don't know this, but I'm not closed off to that. But to say that that means Jesus himself was that experience, that I think that's way overstepping the boundaries of possibly spiked wine within a ritualistic ceremony or something. Like, that's different than, in my opinion, than saying Jesus himself was the ritual. You see what I'm saying? Like,
yeah. And so, as one can imagine, Allegro's work was not taken fondly. That's an understatement, to say the least. There was mass protest from academics. And Allegro had anticipated this. So Allegro is occasionally brought up as a case of mythicist who was forced out of academia and was like fired from his position. This is not true. He was not fired. He actually left his academic position before the publication of the book. But basically, he was kind of forced out in the way that basically this was the last straw. He had already had a history with controversial ideas that were not being accepted at all. And this was kind of like the straw that broke the camel's back. Finally, they were like, okay, why are we still listening to him? There were a mass ton of reviews published of his work, all of them scathing by academics. I only think I found one that was even remotely positive in the entire English-speaking world. It was just lambasted. It was bad enough that there was a letter signed by several academics in a newspaper in England, including by his dissertation advisor, basically condemning the work. And it got to the point that the publisher actually apologized for publishing it. Easily one of the biggest controversies in recent history on whether Jesus existed. But despite this, he did get picked up by secularist movements, and we'll get to that because in the 1980s there was a bit of a fiasco because of it, actually, again, but in the atheist community. But then contemporaneously, at the same time, there was an academic who was not actually a Bible scholar, but he was more or less at least taken seriously. And this was G.A. Wells. G.A. Wells he recently passed away, rest in peace. But he was an academic of German and German intellectual history and language in England. He did not have a specialization in the Bible, but he made sure to do his research and read the literature and to make sure he knew what he was talking about. So he was not by any means a poor academic on the matter. I consider him actually one of the best mythicists to have ever written, personally. And I have most of his works as well. His first book was published in the early 70s. And at the time, he was still arguing that in favor of there being like dying and rising God parallels and stuff to Jesus. G.A. Wells is very notable for being probably the most consistently evolving mythicist in written with his written publications. He changed his views according to criticism. He just admitted he was wrong, and he just kept evolving. And so it actually came to the point that in the 1980s, he actually scorned other mythicists for still doing the pagan parallel stuff. He was like, no, this is wrong. You can actually read this. So he did a brief little debate in a volume edited by R. Joseph Hoffman and Gerald LaRue, published by Prometheus Books, titled Jesus in Myth and History, in the late 1980s. And his contribution to it has basically starts out being like, stop the pagan parallels, just stop. By the 1990s, G.A. Wells actually came to a composite position. So he no longer was actually a traditional mythicist. So as I went through in my first lecture on here, mythicism is the position that there was not, or most likely was not, a historical Jesus of any kind. G.A. Wells took a composite position, which was that there was a historical Jesus and there was also a mythical Jesus that were combined.
This I love this. Okay. This was the question I had when I first started the channel. You go from like a fundamentalist Christian, and trust me, I've learned, even as I've, if you will, deconverted from Christianity, that there are various forms of Christianity. I didn't realize that liberal Christianity can allow you to see things allegorical, allow you to see mythology, things like that, and still believe the Bible, right? Well, I saw Jesus and I said, nah, I just don't buy. I don't buy it anymore. I don't buy that he actually rose from the dead, right? So I have to understand, like, what does that mean, he rose from the dead? Is this a cognitive dissonance where a loved one they experience after he dies in some sense, and then they try to come up with a mythologized tale that he didn't die, he rose from the dead, or something like that, Bart Ehrman type stuff? Or is it all fiction, a part of a legendary tale and stuff? But I have to say, I'm glad we got to this point, because I can see a composite figure making sense of details that are in the Gospels. But this is where I'm at, Chris, is this. I'm not drawing any conclusions to say, oh, yeah, he is a composite figure, just because they may have borrowed from Josephus or something like that. When you write a tale, it doesn't mean they had in mind, let's combine all these different messianics, and therefore we're just creating a composite. They might have laid on top of some of the stuff from historical text of a real guy that may have existed. It doesn't mean there wasn't a guy. And so to say it's composite, I think it's interesting that G.A. Wells went there and he wasn't like strictly mythicist, because I do see Jesus being Ananias, saying, whoa. And we clearly see that with Jesus in the Gospels. And it's like, okay, is that complete fiction, or did they borrow that from this Jesus character to kind of like lay it on the layer of the gospel of Jesus? What is up with this? So anyway, I have to commentary, because I know you're actually giving the real history and you're trying not to be biased. And I know you're like, look, we can get into this if you want, but I want to move on in the history. Anyway, that's for my audience, just to let you know, like, it's good to keep consideration that there may have been a guy. And who knows, a composite of figures, even not complete fiction. You don't have to be a dogmatic mythicist. You can really keep an open mind and consider the evidence, which is what I'm doing. So thanks for letting me say that.
Yep. Yeah. And so Wells is, in my opinion, probably one of the best exemplars. And I really think that people should really take his work more seriously than they do. He was very notable from the standpoint that some very famous academics did take him seriously enough to seriously to physically debate him. For those that are familiar, Morton Smith debated him. Morton Smith is the Secret Gospel of Mark guy, Jesus the Magician, that all of that. He debated G.A. Wells in the 1980s at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor, on whether or not Jesus existed, and then debated him again in that edited volume. So yeah, that he was G.A. Wells was a very public figure. He was also featured on a BBC documentary, which then actually got responded to by James D.G. Dunn. Also, rest in peace. He died this year. One of the greatest New Testament scholars, hands down. But he responded to him in the 1980s in a book called The Evidence for Jesus. He was responded to by R.T. France in another book with the same title in the 1980s. He was responded to by Ian Wilson, by I. Marshall Howard, and numerous others. And most recently was responded to by Bart Ehrman and Maurice Casey. Maurice Casey also passed away in 2014, for those that don't know. So yes, he was very notable specifically for being very well versed in the scholarship, for having consistently evolving views, and for being very consistent, also being pretty well known in the field enough to be responded to quite frequently. His ultimate view was that the Jesus in Paul is a myth based primarily on this personification and conception of Jewish wisdom, and that Jesus did exist as exemplified in the Q document, but at some point in the past, we don't really know when, and that these two were eventually merged into what we have in the Gospels. So it was a really interesting thesis. He passed away in 2017. Contemporaneously, so I'm going to go back again because we have so many figures happening at once. So again, back in the 1970s, almost at the same time as Allegro and Wells, in Germany, there's a different person, Rudolf Augstein. People familiar with Augstein know him from Der Spiegel, which is a political news outlet in Germany. He published a series of articles on whether or not Jesus existed. And then he published a book called Jesus, Son of Man. This largely reiterates a lot of what mythicists from the past were saying. So there's not a whole lot that's new to it. And it's not, in my opinion, worth getting into too much. But it's notable specifically for the endorsements it got. Because it was not just endorsed by mythicists. It was endorsed by David, not David, was it? I'm trying to remember the person specifically. I think it was David Noel Friedman, who, for those that don't know, David Noel Friedman was a leading academic in specifically Old Testament. Sorry, I was just confirming just to make sure. But yeah, it was David Noel Friedman, leading scholar in Old Testament. He was specifically really influential on the developing knowledge that we have of Canaanite religion and how it relates to the Old Testament a lot. He had a massive bibliography, but he wrote the afterword to Augstein's book when it was translated into English in 1977. It was, interestingly enough, also endorsed by Gore Vidal, who wrote the foreword to the book. And then in another place was also another scholar, Samuel Sandbell, who wrote what is a pinnacle of scholarship entitled Parallelomania in the Journal of Biblical Literature. He also was like, yeah, we should really check this out and thank Augstein for writing this. So it got massive endorsements by leading academics world over. But interestingly enough, kind of just fizzled out. It didn't make almost any impact beyond that, except a little bit in Germany, where it caused some controversy among pastors who were like, you're wrong. But it didn't get much beyond that than just brief mentions for the most part. Some German academics also reviewed it and dismissed it, but not much after that. I cannot confirm this yet because I don't have a second edition of the book. But I have heard that in the second edition, he later changed his view to be a historicist. So he might have made a big shift there as well. So now so with that, those are basically our big figures in the 1970s. During the 70s, we also have, if I recall, Lloyd Graham, who wrote a book called The Deceptions in the Bible, or something similar to that. It wasn't particularly at all well received. It didn't have like any notoriety. Lloyd Graham is also a pseudonym. He claimed to be a scholar of some kind, but we have no idea who wrote it. So during that time, we don't have a whole lot more. The 1980s, they're in the 90s. Then there's a huge pickup in mythicist literature, like a massive amount that pops up. 1980s, we begin having the work of Barbara Walker, who is a second wave feminist thinker, and she wrote books like the Women's Encyclopedia of Religion and the Women's Encyclopedia of Secrets, or something like that. I've got both of those volumes. She recently also had an edited volume of a bunch of her essays put together. She became very closely associated with Dorothy Murdoch, actually, also known as Akrai S.
Yeah,
So
if she was still alive, I'd be interviewing her. You know what I mean? I really would.
yeah,
I'd be shocked. I actually kind of speculate in my head sometimes because I have a very good friend of mine who introduced her to me when I was first getting into this stuff, and he was close friends with her. But I kind of wonder where she would be at right now in her research. You know what I'm saying?
yeah,
Like, I kind of wonder about that. Did you ever meet her?
I did not, unfortunately. No,
That'd have been cool. So
it would have, yes. But yeah, during the 80s, we also have others. There were more writings actually being written in India by a few Indian mythicists. In China, actually Kotoko Shutsui's work was translated for like a third time into Chinese in the 1980s. No one knows why. The last major mythicist book in the Soviet Union was published in 1987. That was Joseph Krivlev's Christ, Myth, or Reality, and it was published in English. It's one of the very few mythicist works available in English. It's very hard to find. There is a PDF of it floating around on the internet, but I have no idea where to find it at the moment. So it basically, other than that, you have to hunt down an extremely rare copy of a very niche Soviet book, which
and that is the kind of
there aren't a whole lot of in Red Scare America.
that's what I was gonna say. Like, that is stuff that you are best at. Like, you really have tons of these strange books that nobody will probably ever read.
Yeah, like so I do have a small collection of like Soviet mythicist work, but I've largely had to import this from other countries in order to get my hands on it.
Wow.
So like this came from Russia. This is Ranovik's work. This is one of Krivlev's from the 1960s. This guy came from Russia as well. This is Yakov Lensman's Origins of Christianity, and this is another book by Krivlev. These are translated into French, and these came from France. And then this was actually a mythicist Soviet textbook used to indoctrinate children.
What?
Yes,
that's awesome.
I got this sent to me from Germany. So yeah, you basically have to import most of this stuff to get it. But anyways, so back in the 1980s, during this time in the United States, there is some also pickup of more mythicist works coming out, but they're not getting a whole lot of attention yet. There are like some brief mentions of it. So like in a book that Craig Blomberg published in the 1980s, he mentions it briefly, just in footnotes. It was literally a footnote issue at the time. 1990s really start changing this a lot. So in the 1990s, we have a number of academics that are beginning to respond to mythicists more in full. So Karsten Peter Thied in Germany, he was a specialist on papyrology. He's specifically noted for peddling the conjectural, pretty bad theory that the Gospel of Mark was found in a Dead Sea Scroll fragment. It's been almost completely disproven by more analyses, but he became noted because he wrote 2 books responding to mythicists. The last one was published in the early 2000s, right after he died. It was published posthumously. First one was in the 1990s. Simultaneously, at the same time, Murray J. Harris, who's a New Testament scholar, published 3 crucial questions about Jesus or New Testament or something like that. That was published with Wittenstock. First chapter of that deals with whether or not Jesus existed, and he argues that he did based on extra biblical criteria. But then mythicists are also publishing en masse during this time. A particularly popular view that sprung up was actually the astrotheological views of Jesus, so that he was a personification of the sun, and the 12 apostles are the zodiac. So it's basically just a astrological play theme, basically. There were a number of works like that, like from Zine Winter. Akariah S., very notably, published The Christ Conspiracy during this time. Malik Jabbar, who's a mythicist out of Ohio. And then also, actually, in all the same year, there were a number of mythicist books all published, all of which are basically instrumental for pushing it then into the mainstream more. All in the year 1999, they were published. Earl Doherty's The Jesus Puzzle, Akariah S., The Christ Conspiracy, and Timothy Freak and Peter Gandy's The Pagan Christ, or something like that. Or some of the Jesus Mysteries. That's what it was, the Jesus Mysteries. So all 3 of them published the same year, 1999, and that pushed it into a lot of mainstream attention for an amount of time. But also during this time, we have a very notable series of publications that are coming out, which is the Journal of Higher Criticism. Journal of Higher Criticism starts in the early 1980s. It's sponsored by Drew University, if I recall correctly, and the Institute of Higher Criticism, and it's edited by Daryl Dowdy and Robert M. Price. The first issue comes out with Daryl Dowdy's are basically writing a publication where he doubts the authenticity of all of the Pauline epistles. Gerald Dowdy, basically during this time, he's contemporaneous and simultaneously arguing at the same time with Herman Datering. Herman Datering over in Germany is the first of the neo Dutch radicals, in my view. He basically
So you have Herman Datering. I just say Datering. Yep. Dr. Robert M. Price, and is it Dr. Datering? Dr. Datering?
Yeah.
Dr. Price.
And then Dr. Dowdy.
Yep. Okay. So you have these 3 gentlemen that are all kind of neo.
Yep. All would become neo-Dutch radicals.
Okay.
Robert Price actually would be the last of them to switch over. But the first of them is Herman Datering. Herman Datering he wrote his entire dissertation on this, which then got published with Peter Long in 1992. And then Gerald Dowdy publishes in the Journal of Higher Criticism in English. And then Robert Price follows not long after. So we have basically the Dutch radical school is quasi-revived. Oddly enough, there are a few Dutch academics and theologians that are still Dutch radicals, who were students of Vandenberg van Icenia, who was the last of the main group, and he died in the 50s, but none of them had like any scholarly presence. So Datering is the next to really launch them back into academia, followed by Dowdy and then Price. And then this is basically follows the trajectory for the Journal of Higher Criticism. The Journal of Higher Criticism from that point on basically publishes a lot of things that probably would not make it into most mainstream journals, but are nonetheless very interesting and I think well worth looking into with a lot of them. Actually, as one can see here, I have an entire back catalog of old issues of it. So then in the mid 1990s, Earl Doherty publishes in it, and also Herman Datering publishes his first English article in it, which is the Dutch radical approach to the Pauline Epistles. And that basically cements it in the English-speaking world with at least some of the mythicists that are going on. Noteworthy, though, is that Datering is not a mythicist at this point. And in fact, in his book, Early Christianity in the Twilight, The Fabricated Paul, he actually explicitly states that he thinks Jesus existed. That was also translated into English by Daryl Dowdy and then published in issue 10-2 of the Journal of Higher Criticism as well. And then later, Datering also published it himself in 2018 in English. So it's widely available on Amazon for those that want to read it in English, and it's also available in German. But Datering would actually later change his views from those of being a historicist to a mythicist. One of the last books he published before his death argues that. So basically then going into we're now entering into the 2000s. It's also worth noting, I should actually backtrack a little bit because we do need to actually mention this one place, and it's American Atheist. So it's an atheist and secularist organization. It was started by Madeleine Murray O'Hair. It's particularly noteworthy because it has a long-standing association with publishing mythicist work. In fact, it's one of the most common places that mythicist stuff got published. Another common place being Prometheus books. American Atheist, under Madeleine Murray O'Hair, actually brought in John Allegro in the 1980s. They were going to do a tour and speaking engagements over in England, and it actually turned into a whole fiasco because it was poor. It was very, very poorly managed, and also many of the speakers associated, including Allegro, were misled by O'Hair and others. And it basically was bad enough that Allegro dropped off of the circuit that they were going to do. So that it went south, needless to say. But this had been, while they were during this whole thing, they had been promoting his work, but then they just completely misled him. It was mishandled so bad. This can actually be read about in the biography about John Allegro. It was written by his daughter, Judith, and it was published in Eerdmans in early 2000s. So you can just go find that. But basically, into the 80s, they were also publishing the work of John G. Jackson. He was an Afrocentric academic, and wrote a few works throughout his life on whether or not Jesus existed. The main one that was really popular was Christianity Before Christ, which got its last edition right after he died in the early 2000s, published by American Atheist. Also notable is Frank R. Zindler, the editor of the press, primarily because he did a lot of his own publications, and then also he also translated stuff into English. It was pretty noteworthy because he translated Arthur Drevs's work, The Legend of St. Peter, into English for the first time in 1997, if I recall correctly. And that was published in the press. And then in the early 2000s, so now we're back to where we were. So in the early 2000s, then Frank R. Zindler publishes The Jesus That the Jews Never Knew, where he goes through all of the Jewish writings on that talk about Jesus, and he basically argues that it was either all knowledgeable of Christian doctrine or were interpolations and similar things, and so there was like no independent evidence from Jewish sources that Jesus existed. Other works that were published around this same time then are the year 2000. Robert M. Price publishes Deconstructing Jesus, and then shortly after he writes The Incredible Shrinking Son of Man. Then we have a few other publications that start appearing. So we have primarily a lot of stuff from popular presses. And this is also like the start of the self-publishing services popping up. So we start seeing that a lot more entering into the fray. But then we also see it catching in the mainstream a little bit more and catching academic attention again. So Deconstructing Jesus was reviewed in a few journals by academics. It was largely rejected for the most part. Noteworthy also during this whole time is that basically is the concept of the dying and rising God was for the most part summarily refuted by academics. This started with Jonathan Z. Smith in the 1980s. He wrote an article that was published in the Encyclopedia of Religion, edited by Mircea Eliade. And basically, he argued that there was no dying and rising gods before Christianity, for the most part. This was followed by Mark S. Smith, who is one of the leading Old Testament scholars out there, and also a expert on Canaanite religion. And he argued that there was probably not a category of dying and rising gods, and he specifically presented a thesis that Baal was not a dying and rising god, but was actually the whole dying and rising episode in the Baal cycle is actually a metaphor for the death and ascension of kingship. And he based this off of a funerary text that they had discovered. What ended up happening then is that in the early 2000s, then Tryggve Medinger publishes his work, The Riddle of Resurrection, which mythicists today try to uphold basically as like the pinnacle of dying and rising God scholarship, because it's like, oh, this definitely proves there's a category of dying and rising gods. This is actually to the contrary. Tryggve Medinger actually argues there was no single category of dying and rising gods. There were gods that die and rise, but there was no category dying and rising gods. There was no, he specifically argues against there being an ideal type. So he argues against basically what Robert Price argued for in Deconstructing Jesus. But he basically went through and he argued that Mark S. Smith's interpretation wasn't very good, but he was pretty fair, and he acknowledged that there were a lot of problems with the dying and rising thesis. For example, there is no evidence of a dying and rising Baal outside of Ugarit. None. That one text is all there is. He also acknowledged that there is no there's not really a lot of solid evidence for deities like Eshmun dying and rising, despite what previous academics had held. Not a whole lot. He adamantly argues there is none whatsoever for Marduk. He agrees with past scholars that was a political propaganda piece, not a piece reflecting a dying and rising God belief at all. He does argue Osiris was, but he actually retracted that later in a review of another book. He basically stated that he concluded that Osiris wasn't dying and rising God, actually. so it's a work that I think has been critically misused since then. But anyways, it was very instrumental in rejuvenating that concept in mythicism again, much to the chagrin of G.A. Wells.
This is
Um,
that's a hot topic within
oh yeah,
mythicism.
yeah, it is.
And it's something that I've had dear to me. I mean, even if there aren't types, one of the things that gets me, like I didn't know the field of conversation here. One of the things that really grabbed me was people died and supposedly rose again from the dead. Like, to me, whether it was, and I know this gets complicated for anyone who watches and does not know some of the stuff that Christopher's talking about here. This is extremely complex because is it talking about a physical? Is it talking about an apotheosis type situation? Like there's varieties of concepts. Is it agricultural? There's so much stuff here that you can't wrap your head around if you haven't really dug into this. You won't really get the whole argument here that you're bringing up. But I think it's important that, like, when I came from Christianity, like all I thought of is that there was only one guy who ever lived, according to any tale ever, that in some way rose from the dead. And of course, the Orthodox position is its physical, literal body. And of course, that's what it seems like the text says, So
Yeah.
regardless, when I started finding out even that there were other figures in history that may have had an apotheosis or some type of ascension type thing, to me, that simple bit of my mind is like, could this play a role? And I don't know, this is why methodology plays a huge importance in this, because I am open to, is this a cognitive dissonance thing? I mean, they do say that, like, if I'm not mistaken, everyone without mental health problems, like everyone who's got like a perfect record of no mental health, still experience their loved one. 15 to 20% of them post-mortem, they experience them in some way. Is that what happened? And so anyway, I leave that question mark for any of my audience
Yeah.
who's watching to think, could this have been a great rabbi or apocalyptic teacher that they loved so much that they thought that they really had experienced him, and therefore everyone out there is starting to fall in line with this. So I don't know. Anyway,
Yeah.
I'll shut up.
So yeah, basically, though, Marcus Smith's and Jonathan Z. Smith's works basically solidified the fate of the dying and rising gods as being permanently dead in the eyes of academia, for the most part. There are other than Trygve Medinger was basically one of the only exceptions to this, largely. There have been a few others since then, but it's not at all become mainstream. Um, the most recent have been scholars like John Granger Cook. But basically, despite that, Medinger's work reinvigorated the concept greatly, recontributed to it being brought back in mythicism in particular, even though his epilogue specifically argues that none of these deities can really be argued to be a parallel to Jesus, actually, because they're all vegetative deities who are tied to agricultural conceptions, not to salvific elements. So what ends up happening after that is we enter into the mid 2000s. A very controversial work came out. It was called Pagan Christ by Tom Harper. Tom Harper had previously done graduate level education in New Testament. He was a qualified academic. He had taught New Testament at University of Toronto in the 1960s, and then he became a journalist after that. But he wrote Pagan Christ in 2004. It was published with Thomas Nelson in Nashville, and it gained quite a lot of notoriety, especially in evangelical circles. It got a number of responses to in the McMaster Journal of Theology, and then also received an entire book in response to it as well. by Stanley Porter and Stephen J. Bedard. And for those that don't know, Stanley Porter is a leading scholar on New Testament, specifically on methodology and historical Jesus. So yeah, it became a very influential debate for from that perspective, and it kind of reinvigorated the whole debate, especially between atheists and Christians again. And that's kind of where it has stayed a lot of in popular discourse. Then, not long afterwards, was announced the Jesus Project. The Jesus Project was supposed to be basically like a sequel to the Jesus Seminar in a way. It was headed by R. Joseph Hoffman and Robert Price, but there were a lot of controversies about it. Robert Price has talked about it before on here. But one of the biggest controversies was its association with mythicism, because there were a lot of mythicists that were associated with the project, including Price, Frank Zindler, Herman Datering, and then Herman Datering was like on the fence at this point. This is the mid 2000s. But then there's also Hector Avalos, who at that point was an avowed agnostic on the concept. And then at one of the meetings, Arthur Droge announced that he was agnostic on the idea that Jesus existed. Arthur Droge is a New Testament academic, by the way. So yeah, it was kind of controversial from that point of view. And then there was also the problem that this, even just aside from the fact that a lot of its membership was questionable, there was the fact that its website, instead of like linking to a lot of academic sources, would do things like link to mythicist blogs and mythicist forums. So it created a huge controversy that basically set the public against it pretty quickly. And so academics like Mark Goodacre and April DeConnick basically were like, yeah, we're not even getting involved with this. So it lost a lot of trucking power soon after. R. Joseph Hoffman in one article was like, stated that there was also an attempt by some mythicists to try and have like their own specified mythicist area in it to study mythicist issues opposed to the historicists. So there's like apparently, according to Hoffman, differing bridges happening within it. It only produced one volume, The Sources of the Jesus Tradition. Was published by Prometheus Books, which also didn't help because Prometheus Books already had had a history of publishing mythicist stuff, and also it's not an academic press. It was specifically a secularist press set up by Paul Kurtz. So the whole thing was just a mess of publicity from the start. The one book that got published didn't make a huge impact. It is notable, however, that there were a number of academics who are still involved in the debate that were in it, who are historicists. So very notably, Justin Mcgee. Justin Mcgee's work is absolutely excellent. I highly suggest it. Last year he also published an article specifically on it was a metacritical paper on the whole debate on Jesus's historicity. But yeah, so that the project basically fizzled out. But during the same time, there are a few other books published in response to mythicists that are still pretty influential today. The first was by Paul Rhodes, who's a leading scholar. He's a New Testament scholar, and Gregory Boyd, who's a theologian and very well-known figure on issues of theology and the Bible. They published The Jesus Legend, which was a whole book arguing for the reliability of the synoptic tradition. And specifically what was notable about it in particular was the fact that the book was not only dense, it's several hundred pages. It responded to various mythicists, so specifically taking aim at Wells, Price, and Doherty. During this time, then we also have a few brief responses happening from like Daniel Wallace and J. Ed Komazowski. We also have another work published, which has also been pretty influential still, and it's called The Historical Jesus 5 Views, which was also edited by James K. Bileby and Paul Rhodes Eddy, or Paul Rhodes, sorry. And so, and basically, that work was noteworthy because literally the first essay in it is Robert Price's Jesus at the Vanishing Point, which people are probably also familiar with because it was published in his The Christ Myth and Its Problems. So that was published. There were 4 responses to Robert Price in it from John Dominic Crossan, Dale Allison, Luke Timothy Johnson, and James D.G. Dunn. So 4 big name New Testament scholars, basically, right there, responding to Price. It was published by University Academic Press. We also have another publisher that has kind of had a little, for a few years anyways, had like a little bit of a symbiotic relationship with Dr. Price. Signature Books in Utah. It's a Mormon press, but it published both of his major works on promoting the Dutch radical ideas. It published first the Pre-Nicene New Testament, which is an absolutely massive tome. I think I have, yeah. This just, it's massive. This is a monster. You could kill your brother with this.
He might have written it for that very reason. You just never know, you know.
I mean, sometimes there's a historicist you just got to beat. But then after that, it published his amazing Colossal Apostle. And so it was really strange. And actually, there was a one writer in a Mormon journal. It basically kind of got a little uppity about it. Actually, it was and it was like Robert Price and Signature Books has this weird symbiotic relationship, and it's not Mormon enough, basically.
I mean, if you read Dr. Price, you would be like, hold on, dude. You know, this doesn't line up with my faith. Yeah.
But then there's one thing that's worth noting, and I hate to do it, and I'm pretty sure most mythicists here will hate that I have to bring it up, but I do. And it was Zeitgeist.
Speaking of Zeitgeist, I don't want to spend too much time. I actually told Dr. Price, he's never watched it, by the way, which you can only imagine an old school guy like him. He always posts about like zombie movies and Frankenstein. Like he likes the classics. And I'm like, look, you haven't seen it? And he said, no. I said, I tell you what, one of these days we'll get donations enough to spend the time and just sit through it. And we get your assessment. I want your critical assessment. And like, I hope we can get this because I think it's important to hear what he might say about it in light of the fact that a lot of people are like, dude, there's a lot of issues that to take place with this. He said, I don't even know if I want to watch it. So that's why I was like, well, maybe we can get the donations for people to like help you sit through, and I'll record you responding to the video as it goes. We'll pause. Okay, first of all, I call baloney on that, and here's why, or whatever, you know, and just comment on it. But in the meantime, yes, I've heard quite a negative views on Zeitgeist, but I heard there's some things that are probably taken out of context and utilized on Jesus that are probably true in the ancient world about agricultural deities and connections to some of the astrotheological kind of stuff, except someone like you would probably go, there's a huge stretch. They're taking probably what was known in antiquity, like way, way back, with these deities, and they're trying to apply it onto Jesus. And do you think, I wanted to ask you about this when we were passing by Acharya and the astrotheology movement that was making an uprising in the late 90s, early 2000s. Do you think there's fragrance, I guess, to give it, like, there's scent in the air, so to speak, somewhere within the New Testament of an astrotheology, but that it's not this strange devil's pulpit? The whole thing is this code and it's all written. I don't buy that. But do you think there's some astrology, these hints of agricultural aspects, but it's not that it is an agricultural text? Does that make sense? Like, do you think there's something there?
There's definitely astrological work in the Bible. There's a lot in the Old Testament.
Samson, for example, probably, or
actually one of the best examples actually is Isaiah 14:12-15. That's the whole narrative of Halel ben Shahar. So the morning star, translated in Greek, Lucifer. That whole thing actually makes use of astrological conceptions of of deity. So basically the for those that don't know, it's a Canaanite myth that's been applied to Nebuchadnezzar, if I remember correctly. Can't remember. Don't quote me on that. But anyways, I know this part. Anyways, so it's probably, in my opinion, and in the opinions of John Day and Ulf Oldenburg and a number of others, is talking about the god Othtar. But Othtar is basically identified by the by the star he is associated with, i.e. Venus, the morning and evening star. He's also being associated, and then he's also being associated with with the polemic of trying to climb above the stars of El. And so this is a very common theme, is that gods are associated with planetary movements in a lot of ways. It starts, it's not that present in the New Testament, but there are like at least some items in the New Testament that attest to at least now awareness of star movement and at least veneration.
That would be probably where the problem comes in, I say, is like it's like black or white, either or. And so often, like, if you see little pieces, they kind of go, what are we not seeing? The whole thing must be hidden secrets of this. And that's where rabbit trails. Yeah.
That's what Sandmel would have characterized as another episode of Parallelomania. And I personally don't find the astrological views convincing. Most of the academic mythicists never did. I'm gonna quote Yosef Krivlev in Christ, Myth or Reality, but it more resembles mental gymnastics.
I can respect that, because I understand why people do it. I just ask that those people, and I ask those who are watching right now, who might believe this, they might believe what you're saying you don't believe, right? I want them to just understand that, like, look, who knows, right? We could be wrong, or you could be wrong. And I say that to say, keep an open mind, continue to research, keep studying, don't take offense. You know, you're not trying to jab at somebody. You have an opinion, and you do conclude different opinions than you disagree with me. Like, you are more certain there was a Jesus, where I'm like, I can see it. And then I'm like back and forth, tug of war sometimes. But like, I do see that as a thing. And we're really good friends. Like, we're not enemies at all, because that, like, what you think about a text shouldn't reflect how you discuss in the situation. But anyway, you were getting a Zeitgeist, so I kind of really took you off track.
No, actually, it's actually fine, because Zeitgeist basically really works from the work of Acharya S a lot. And she later wrote the source book for it, actually, along with the director. And so it's well worth bringing up, actually. Zeitgeist basically promoted an astrotheological idea that Jesus was this myth based on the stars. it takes a lot from the Christ conspiracy. And this is where I need to bring up a lot of the theories that they were bringing up, that they were making use of, are really bad. And it's not because necessarily that the argument is a bad argument, but it's because the evidence they're using is not actually evidence. This was a major criticism of Acharya S, and it's one that she tried to somewhat resolve in later books, but she still fell into it a lot, was this use of a lot of old 19th century writers, a lot of old 19th century mythicist writers who didn't quite know what they were talking about. One of these, and the one that's most pertinent, well, there's two. The two that are most pertinent here are Gerald Massey and Alvin Boyd Kuhn. Gerald Massey was a self-taught Egyptologist. I hate using that word because, and I'm not kidding, virtually every Egyptologist on the world disowns him. He could not really actually read hieroglyphs, and he also fabricated a lot of stuff. So he is where the nonsense ideas of Jesus being baptized by Anup the Baptizer started, or the idea that Osiris had 12 disciples and a bunch of other nonsense like that. Some of it was based off of him misreading the hieroglyphics, and then a lot of it was based on him just making things up. But it got popular, and it got popular because then Alvin Boyd Kuhn used it. Alvin Boyd Kuhn, not a biblical scholar in any way. He was actually a theosophist. I'm not going to get into what theosophy is because it's really complicated. You can just look it up. But it's basically like a kind of...
Spell it for them real quick, just so they can look it up.
Theosophy, theosophy.
Okay. Got it.
It's basically a spiritualist religion. It was started by Helena Blavatsky in the 1800s. Alvin Boyd Kuhn is notable specifically because he got a PhD in theosophy. Columbia is also going to come up again because it is the alma mater of another mythicist who's very popular now. But basically, he wrote numerous books. They were almost all self-published, and they had basically no notoriety during his life. He died in the 60s, if I recall correctly. The only place where they had much of any influence were in theosophist movements. But then they were picked up again by Acharya S in the 90s, and then also by Tom Harper. Tom Harper based the Pagan Christ largely off of the work of Massey and off of Kuhn. And Kuhn is noted, he's again in that school of looks alike, is alike when it comes to linguistics. So for example, he tries to argue that the Spanish the Spanish article el, meaning the, comes from the Hebrew el, meaning God, because they look the same. And then he tries to argue that our article the comes from the word theos in Greek, meaning God. He has a lot of just absolute nonsense like that, and it's strewn throughout. He did not cite things very well. This was a habit of a lot of those schools, is that they didn't cite things very well, and when they did, usually went to a bad source like Massey. And so this is what basically plagues Zeitgeist. And this is why you get things like the idea of Mithras being a dying and rising savior god who had 12 disciples and stuff. No, he didn't. We have no evidence of any of it. And if you want to and it's actually gotten to the place now where it was bad enough that lots of the more credible mythicists had to hammer this back into the ground because they're like, stop, you're giving mythicists a bad name. So Zeitgeist and Akira S and Tom Harper kind of like created this huge split in mythicism, and a huge amount of infighting occurred. And Robert Price was actually part of this. Robert Price wrote a scathing review of the Christ conspiracy, which he later regretted. He later came to the conclusion, in one of his other reviews of Akira's work, that we should like team up, even if we disagree, and not like point out all the faults and stuff. And that's a whole methodological thing that I'm not getting into. But anyways, there was Robert Price also wrote a pretty scathing review of Tom Harper's work, and then Zeitgeist basically became the fuel of evangelical apologists world over to be like, look how stupid mythicists are, because it was just a bad documentary, and it was bad research, it was bad sources, and it said a bunch of things that are just ostensibly not true. So it gave them a lot of fuel to basically really, really hammer mythicists down a lot. And it made it a lot harder for mythicists, I think, to get much recognition, which is why I bring it up too, because despite the fact that it's such a negative part of mythicism's history, it is important in like the public perception of it. But it got basically rejected by most of the leading mythicists out there. It got lambasted by Carrier and others. So it's most of the more of what we consider a lot of the more credible mythicists have basically just turned their backs to that sort of thing. So then entering into the 2010s, where the most major stuff recently happens, there's a number of really important things that get published. So firstly, we have it is actually, real quick, in 2009, Richard Carrier publishes one of his first books on the issue, Not the Impossible Faith, which has become a little bit instrumental lately. He cites it a lot in his other books. It was a self-published book through Lulu. But anyways, in 2012, Bart Ehrman publishes Did Jesus Exist? Though there had been quite a few, and I will actually provide you with a link with it, but I have a huge bibliography of mythicist works and responses to mythicists. There's been over 90 responses to mythicists since the 70s. But basically, despite the fact that there were quite a few responses, none of them were particularly publicized in a popular way, in a way that got a lot of recognition. This is where Bart Ehrman's work comes in, because Did Jesus Exist was published in 2012 again, and published by Harper One. And at the time, and to this current day, Bart Ehrman has been one of the most well-known public New Testament scholars out there. He's coming off of the fame of misquoting Jesus, Jesus Interrupted, and a bunch of other books which were just absolutely insanely well received by the public. And so he writes, Did Jesus Exist? His response to the idea to mythicists. For me, the book is a mixed bag. I think there's a lot of good things in it. I think there's a lot of things he could have done better. I don't like the fact that he argues using hypothetical sources. I think he's very right to call out that the extra biblical sources aren't that useful for Jesus. But anyways, the book was very popular. Most people liked it and accepted it. It's become kind of a mainstay, especially by evangelicals. But it did not sit well with the mythicists that much, and it got a full massive treatise response by Frank Zindler, Earl Doherty, Renee Salm, Robert Price, Richard Carrier, Akariah S. in an edited volume called Bart Ehrman and the Quest for the Historical Jesus of Nazareth. And that was published in American Atheist again. And basically was super, it was super controversial to say the least. Renee Salm at the very least like thanked Bart Ehrman for at least making the issue known enough to warrant responses, and mythicists were at least accepting of the fact that Ehrman quite right, in my opinion, rightfully held that mythicists should be actually responded to by academics. They should not just be ignored and sidelined. Then the same year, and with an epilogue that responded to Ehrman, was the first peer-reviewed mythicist book of the 21st century, and that's Thomas L. Brody's "The Quest Beyond Beyond the Quest for the Historical Jesus," published by Sheffield Phoenix Press. The book is basically a memoir of how he came to conclude that Jesus never existed, which he came to in the 1970s. It is really worth noting that Brody did not know of any other mythicist literature at that time. He came to this conclusion completely independently. It's also well worth noting that he's not an atheist. He's a Christian, and he holds to be he was a Dominican priest, and he still holds to be a Dominican Catholic, in spite of the fact that he thinks Jesus didn't exist. This is a long tradition in mythicists, actually. G.A. Vandenberg van Assignia was a pastor, and so were a number of other of the Dutch radicals. Albert Kalthoff was a pastor as well. Then there's also William Montgomery Brown, who was a Marxist and Episcopal priest, and one of the first of the 20th century to be tried for heresy. And then most recently has been Edward van der Kosh in the Netherlands, who's also a mythicist, and he's also a pastor. His views are largely based off of the Jesus Mysteries by freaking Gandhi. So there's a long tradition of Christian mythicists, actually.
And oftentimes what I see, if they're not Christians, or they don't claim Christian, some might, they're New Agers. In some sense, they're spiritual mythicists, and they sound just like Christians to me. The way that I've listened to a lot of them communicate. I mean, I've watched some lives about one guy named Mythicist on Facebook. I'll leave his name unknown. But it's extremely like he goes into these little lives on his Facebook, and there's only like 2 or 3 people watching, but he like goes into these long prayer chants and stuff. Like he sits there and he just like for a while, and I'm thinking, okay, it's not necessarily an academic thing for these guys. Maybe they have some reason why they really think why they want to argue that way, if you will, for Jesus not existing. It's not about any evidence. Whereas like for me, it's not. One might go, well, you're biased. You don't want Christianity to be true. And I've had people actually try to say that of me. I don't think that Christianity is true, not in any ontological sense. I don't think that a guy actually rose from the dead. I don't believe in those things anymore. The question of whether he existed became a seriously curious one for me, because I started seeing that there are mythologies of the world. Like I didn't even know about mythologies like that. I mean, never took serious that real Greeks in some time in the past thought Zeus and Apollo were real beings that actually existed at some point. Things like that. Just those ideas was like, how could someone actually believe those things were true? And so I started to come out of it, and maybe went to the far extreme, starting with the he didn't exist and everything, and all of it's astrotheology and it's all a myth and everything. and I did go that path, to sweeping away. I always refer to it as like I'm on a dirt lot playing a soccer game, and I start to find out there's a concrete basin underneath this, and I'm sweeping, or there's some bones. I'm finding dinosaur fossils, and I'm like, whoa, hold on, there's some meat to this. I didn't know. And so that's kind of been my own journey. But anyway, I don't want to stop you anymore because
Yeah.
we're already getting quite far into this.
Yeah. So basically, this is just to say, I want to emphasize that not all mythicists are atheists, though the vast majority of them are, and the vast majority of them are also ex-Christians on top of this. But I'm not saying this as any kind of aspersion or to like dismiss them like Maurice Casey kind of did. It's I know I try to note it more for sociological study reasons. It's like, okay, well, a lot of them are ex-Christians, a lot of them are and atheists and now mythicists. There are also in the new pagan communities, mythicism has been somewhat popular as well. Sorry. So yeah. Anyways, basically, Thomas Brody's work was pretty noteworthy. It caused a big scandal in the Dominican order. He became one of only two academic mythicists I know of, the other being Bruno Bauer, to ever lose academic privileges over mythicism. He got basically banned from teaching and writing by the Dominican order because well, mythical Jesuses are not usually part of Catholic and Dominican tradition, Dominican order tradition. So yeah, he did, it didn't fare well for him. But basically, after that, then there is somewhat a little bit of a lull. I think in 2012 or 2013, though, Raphael Lotchester in Australia basically passes his master's thesis, which was on the him basically evaluating mythicism. Then in 2014, we have two big ones. We have Maurice Casey's Jesus, Evidence and this is one that came out first, Evidence and Argument or Mythicist Myths, published by Bloomsbury. Bloomsbury is particularly notable because it is a very well-known and very, very well-respected publisher on religion and biblical issues. But his work largely took aim not at academic mythicists, but of the more popular ones. Really took aim at like Harold Lintner, who was a lawyer. He passed away in the early 2000s. Akariah S., Freaking Gandhi, and others. And then he also noteworthy is his introduction to this basically his who's who in the debate, and it's a mixed bag to say the least. But then the same year is then Richard Carrier's tome on the Historicity of Jesus in 2014. It was published by Sheffield Phoenix Press. It's been heralded as one of this great achievement for peer review. It's Carrier argues that it is the first peer-reviewed case for mythicism and an alternative start for Christianity. It's not actually. In 1993, the first one is Jean Magne, who published in Brown Judaic Studies series, and it was endorsed by Jacob Neusner. It's called From Gnosis to Christianity and From Christianity to Gnosis. For those interested. I don't think it's in print any longer, but you can find used copies of it fairly cheaply. So that was actually the first. And then, but anyways, his is by far the most comprehensive. His work basic his book is in a school of thought which I identify there being various schools of thought in mythicism. So the astrotheological school that is current today is a unification of two older schools of thought. So there was the French astrotheologists, and then and then with Acharya S, they're really unified with the Egypt centrists, like Massey, and basically become an Egypto-astrotheological school of thought. And we see that now most recently with Pierre Tulip, and then the second edition of the Christ Conspiracy by Acharya S, edited by Robert Price. The other thing, though, the thing with Carriers is Carriers comes out of out of the French schools as well, but out of a different one. This one is primarily founded by Paul Louis Couchu, who we talked about before. And then it's funneled through G.A. Wells, and then through G.A. Wells and Paul Louis Couchu, we get Earl Doherty's work. And then Carriers is basically the successor of Earl Doherty. In fact, it's eerily similar on most levels. The argumentation is largely the same. So it's basically, they both use the ascension of Isaiah to make the case that there were conceptions of Jesus as a purely celestial being existing in the heavens, who's died and crucified in this sublunar realm in outer space. No, I don't like Carriers.
You're not a fan of this mythicism.
I am not a fan. It's not
teasing.
that I'm not a fan of the mythicism. It's that I'm not a fan of the language, because it's just really weird. But anyways, basically the idea is that Jesus dies between like the firmament and earth, in up there. He never comes to earth. He's just a purely celestial being, and that's how Paul originally refers to him. And then he argues on the bit. I should have mentioned this earlier. Just a brief note. As predecessors to this, there's also an edited volume, Is This Not the Carpenter by Thomas Thompson and Thomas Verena, which has a bunch of mythicist works in it by Robert Price, Thomas Verena, as well as responses. Thomas Verena's work is the one that's most pertinent here because Carrier uses Verena's allegorical readings of various passages to argue that Paul is just allegorizing a celestial Jesus, that there was no historical Jesus in Paul's writings.
Kind of like Galatians chapter 4 with the mother above, these arguments of him being born of a woman. Oh, well, what woman? The woman from above, which is mother. It's not a literal biological mom, but making an allegorical and stuff, and on and on.
Yeah, and then like Romans 1:3, he argues that the word genomenos there, he argues literally means to make or manufacture, and that Jesus is manufactured out of the sperm of David, which was stored in the heavens in a, quote, cosmic sperm bank, unquote. But anyways, that's like the basic thesis. There's other things that are interesting about Carrier's work. He tries to reinvigorate the dying and rising God in it, but it doesn't really serve a huge purpose that I can see in his work. Honestly, he can make his case without it, in my opinion. It's kind of just there. He also argues that Philo has this pre-Christian Jesus in his work on the confusion of tongues, and this is largely based on Carrier's conjecture that Philo conceptualized his logos as this figure Jesus in the book of Zechariah. But the LXX makes it clear that the person that builds the temple in Zechariah 12 and 13, i.e. the branch, isn't actually Jesus. It's Zerubbabel, which you read in the previous 2 chapters, and then also in verse 13. Anyways, it's a really weird thing. It's not been well received. It was actually argued against by Larry Hurtado and by Joel Edmund Anderson. Um, Basically, his thesis is just that purely celestial Jesus dies crucified in the heavens. Um, and what's really notable about his work, and probably in my opinion, the most noteworthy thing, is his attempt to apply a new methodology to the issue of historicity, and it's by the use of Bayesian probability theorem. And for those that don't know, it's a probability theorem basically meant to assess the likelihood of X happening. And so the first thing you have to do is like assess your prior probability. Carrier does this by making use of the Raglan archetype. He argues that there's no historical figure that scores 11 above 11 points. So basically the cutoff is 12. If you get 12 or more, you have a prior probability of being most likely mythical, because all of the figures that score above 12 are usually mythical figures. So like Osiris, Romulus, Osiris, Romulus, other
Zalmoxis and other, I think he
Zalmoxis
uses.
actually wouldn't score that highly on it because we don't have very much at all on Zalmoxis.
I just throwing the
Yeah.
name out because I didn't know if that
Anyway,
was one of them.
anyways, he basically has just 15 figures on this. Jesus is one of them. At best, Jesus has a 33% chance of having for his prior probability, and then the low is like extremely low. And then after he goes through everything, he makes an argument from silence for the extra biblical sources, which is a pretty standard mythicist argument. It's probably the most universal one. It's one you can find in China, Japan, India, the Soviet Union, Germany, everywhere. That's probably the only universal mythicist argument. And then argues the Gospels can't be used as good sources because they're basically just myth. And then he goes into the Epistles and argues that those are most likely talking about a celestial being. So then so that's his main conclusion. Carrier's work has been lauded by mythicists as probably one of the best works for mythicism out there. It has been pretty much condemned by most academics. The only exception to this is Raphael Lotchester, who's agnostic on Jesus' historicity. He published the first review of it, if I recall correctly, in the Journal of Religion, which is a very positive review. Avizer Tucker, who is the only other major proponent I know of who argues Bayesian probability can be used for history. But he basically argues that Carrier should have that Carrier was too dismissive of other methodologies for assessing Jesus's historicity, and so he doesn't really agree with Carrier necessarily on this. Christina Pedersen, she is she's a New Testament scholar, and then also she studies Christianity, like in the 18th and 19th centuries a lot. She's noted for like works like this, from Tomb to Text and stuff like that. But anyways, she wrote a review of his on the historicity of Jesus in Religare, and was scathing. She referred to Carrier's work as she basically was like, nothing in this work shocked me. It was pretty rudimentary first year New Testament stuff, was how she referred to it in her review. Carrier got extremely upset with this and actually tried to claim that she was a Christian. She's actually an atheist. She's actually a Marxist atheist. So he was like very wrong. But it goes into, I'll go into this a little bit later, but there's a real polemical attitude in this debate that's, I think, really unhealthy for it actually progressing. But anyways, after Carrier's work, which was pretty noteworthy for being like the first peer-reviewed text, even the peer review process that went on in his book has come under some scrutiny. After that, actually, Sheffield Phoenix Press had like this whole shift of management that occurred. And I have heard from some people, I can't name sources, but Carrier's book has kind of been viewed like the unfortunate side of the press by its latest managers and stuff. So it's not it's not taken highly. Unfortunately, it's not really it's not worked with much at all either in academia. There have been a few other rebuttals to Carrier by Simon Gaither-Cole and Daniel Galata. Both of them in the Journal for a Study of Study of Historical Jesus. Carrier's argument that the Tacitus passage was inauthentic has also been rebutted to by Willem Blom in Vigile Christiane as well. So there's been a lot of stuff that's been made in response to him. There's not been a whole lot of acceptance of most of his ideas. One that has caught a little traction actually is his identification of he has a little bit in the on Historicity of Jesus on the star and the Magi in the Gospels, and that idea has actually gotten a little bit of recognition more. So it's not all negative that's happened, but it is mostly the case. Renee Salm then in 2015 published a new book. So he published previously a book on the idea that Nazareth never existed in the first century, and he published another one in 2015 called Nazareth Gate. That it has since been rejected by almost every single archaeologist. Actually, I think every single archaeologist that has ever talked about the issue has basically explicitly rejected his work. The most public on this has been Ken Dark, who as recently as this year rejected Psalm's stuff again. Then Herman Datering continued publishing more works. He wrote a book basically arguing against any of the sources for Jesus being authentic. He then wrote another book arguing that none of the letters of St. Augustine are authentic. And then his final works were basically on the historicity of Jesus, and he argued that Jesus didn't exist. And then Datering passed away in 2018. He had been suffering from, I believe, cancer, and he hadn't really told anyone. So he sadly passed on. Then basically after that, there's not a whole lot academically going on. There are more mythicist works that were published. There's been don't get me wrong, there's been a absolute mass of mythicist works published popularly. It is worth noting in 2018, the Journal of Higher Criticism was restarted. It's no longer endorsed by any university, and it's not peer-reviewed, but it has been restarted by Dr. Price and Alex Criddle as the main editors. And it has had a number of academics still that have published in it, like Christian Lintner. Christian Lintner is also a mythicist. He's a professor of Buddhist studies. He was associated with the University of Copenhagen, which is the same one that Thomas L. Thompson is associated with. But he basically argues that Paul and Jesus never existed, and there's it's a really complicated mathematical cipher and stuff based on Buddhism and Sanskrit and things. It's really complicated. But I don't think he's ever published any books on the matter. I could be wrong on that, but I haven't seen any. So yeah, like Christian Lintner's published in it. I believe Russell Gamerkin is going to have an article in the Journal of Higher Criticism. I've had 2 in the Journal of Higher Criticism before. So anyways, going on from that, then from 2018, in 2019 comes some very notable developments, and these are basically some of the most recent until yesterday, I think. So in 2019, was the next peer-reviewed book advocating questioning Jesus' historicity. This is Questioning the Historicity of Jesus by Raphael Lotchester, published with Rodopi, which is a publishing imprint under Brill. This book is on it. I do have a copy of this book. It's unfortunately extreme. Where is it? Anyways, it's unfortunately really expensive. It's like $210.
Jeez.
Yeah, it's like not affordable under any metric at all. But this is following a ton of like papers that Lotchester has published, and also he had published he'd done two self-published books through CreateSpace, both which he took down. Jesus Did Not Exist, and There Was No Jesus, and There Was No God. And then he published his dissertation, which is The Case Against Theism. And that was published in the academic press Springer, and also has a brief chapter on why Jesus may not have existed. But Questioning the Historicity of Jesus is basically supposed to be kind of a meta critique of the debate in a way. So he basically he has his introduction. His introduction is very strange, and very polemical. He basically critiques New Testament scholars who call out the fact that a lot of mythicists are unqualified, and he tries to make the case that all New Testament scholars are unqualified to talk about the historicity of Jesus. Funnily enough, very coincidental and very lucky for Lotchester, though, analytical philosophers like Lotchester are definitely qualified for it. It's funny how those things work out when you have a narrative, right? A little bit. But there's other things that are really obvious about it, like that he has a narrative. Like he has an entire section where he wants to argue that Christians should be excluded from the debate. He also, and then his next section is the case for historicity, where he examines Maurice Casey and Bart Ehrman's works, and he's very insulting on a regular basis, accuses them of being like liars and hacks and stuff like that. It's very, very harsh. Then in the next section is the case for agnosticism. He's an agnostic. And then after that's a case for mythicism. Both of them are very, very reliant on the works of Richard Carrier. For the most part, like most of all of his interpretations and ideas are based on Carrier. Occasionally he steps into Dutch radical realm, which is really interesting. So I think he recognizes that some of Carrier's interpretations of Paul are strained. So he instead actually posits that they could be interpolations. And so he's falling back on like the work of Doughty and the work of Robert M. Price. The ways he does this is usually by appeal to Marcion, which has a lot of methodological problems, but I'm not going to get into those because it's a long thing. But anyways, that's the most recent peer-reviewed work on the matter. It has received one very short review, but the reviewer was basically of the opinion that the work is interesting and would probably be notable for mythicists, but academics will probably overlook it. It's only been published for a year now, so there's not a whole lot to say yet. I know for a fact that James McGrath has received a review copy of it and is planning to produce a review of it. So we're going to probably see that, but I haven't seen it cited in any academic literature since then. Other books that have been published though since then are works like Michael Lawrence has published a book on his theory on the early Christianity. And then Entering into 2020, there are a few notable things that have come out. One of the most, probably in my opinion, one of the most interesting is the second edition of The Christ Conspiracy by Akaraya S. It was like her final wish that that book be redone because it was really badly lambasted. And so Dr. Price and a few others got together basically to edit it and help set a second edition up for it. And so that was published this year in, I believe, March. And then at the next most notable thing, which I believe came out either yesterday or the day before, might have been the day before, it might have been Tuesday. Anyways, the most recent one is, and also probably the silliest named in all of these, is the one and only Jesus from Outer Space by Richard Carrier. It is, and it's basically just an abridged popular version of On the Historicity of Jesus. There's not much new. Occasionally he responds to some of his latest critics, but other than that, there's not a whole lot of changes. But that came out just recently. And so the only thing other that's really worth noting are the fact that there have been a pickup of debates by like public debates on the historicity of Jesus. A well-publicized one was at Mythicists Milwaukee in 2016. And it was between Robert Price and Bart Ehrman. But there's been others. Richard Carrier debated Dennis MacDonald. And for those that aren't aware, it was partially based on the fact that Carrier used a lot of Dennis MacDonald's work in OHJ, and Dennis MacDonald didn't always take kindly to that because he felt his views were a little misconstrued. Carrier has also debated Mark Goodacre. He has debated Ziba Crook and Craig Evans as well. So there's been some pretty high-profile debates going on. In Spanish academia, there's also been a number of others as well. There was an edited volume in 2008 called it that was edited by Antonio Pinheiro, and it was a collection of essays from several academics, including one of my favorites, Fernando Bermeo Rubio, on the historicity of Jesus. And then he recently did a third edition to one of his main books on it that was published in 2018 or 2019 as well. And so there's actually been a number of Spanish academics involved in this issue. It's definitely not calmed down there at all. There's been one main French academic I know of who's been involved, but he's not a biblical scholar. He's a philosopher, and it's Michel Onfray, who argued based on the works of G.A. Wells that Jesus didn't exist. But to my knowledge, it didn't receive like any recognition really, other than it got a few there were a few news outlets that commented on it, but other than that, it died out pretty quickly. French academics are basically unanimous that Jesus existed. German academics, I think, just for the most part, pretend that this debate doesn't exist. It's really a big thing, though, in the UK, America, and Australia. It is the case that mythicism is most certainly on the rise in the popular audiences. A recent poll by Barna Group estimated that about 39% of England doubts whether Jesus existed. 39%, that's over 1/3. In the United States, it's over 8%. And in Australia, there were around 90 to 100,000 people that doubted Jesus existed. So there's tens of millions of people in those three countries that think that Jesus may not have existed. I would happen to guess. Actually, I know from a fact that from James McGrath that it is still occasionally promulgated in Romania. Um, Romania was under was very influenced by the Soviet Union and communist regimes. Um, there are occasional comments on it in Czechoslovakia. Czechoslovakia actually had its own major debate on whether or not Jesus existed. Basically, it was in the 1980s. There was a whole conference on it actually among academics, and they were all like, "Yeah, he existed." um, and then I'm gonna guess that it's probably still a thing among popular audiences in Russia and in China. It is still published on in India. There is the prime minister of if I remember, I believe it was Syria. I might be wrong on that. Anyway, one of the prime ministers over there in the Middle East actually stated that Jesus didn't exist. There was a presidential candidate in I believe it was Finland. Again, not off the top of my head. Anyways, but she basically lost the election because she thought Jesus may not have existed. So
I mean,
yeah,
look, I have to say, we're here now, right? We're at 2020. You missed one of the most important things, though. MythVision podcast has played a
oh
huge
yeah.
role.
Well, I'm going to get to that because actually, popular. Yeah, I think that probably one of the most one of the ways that it's probably spread the fastest has been through popular outlets like MythVision. Also among especially among but also especially among YouTubers in the atheist community. So Arn Ra, Godless Engineer are those are two very notable examples of this who have promoted these views. Arn Ra in particular, with his associations with Richard Carrier.
I must say, and we're getting close to the end of the hour, you know.
Yep.
So, give us a few more, and I'll give you some closing statements, or give us whatever you'd like to top off with here.
So, I'm just actually going to close it with what I hope for the future. I think that there's something to be said that we need to actually correct a lot of the discourse going on. Not from the standpoint that I think that necessarily that we need to like correct the ideas, but the way that discourse is actually done. So, for example, Raphael Lotchester's work is very clearly anti-Christian. He thinks Christians should be excluded from the debate explicitly. He explicitly states that. Richard Carrier has a habit of very frequently lambasting, verbally abusing his opponents who criticize him, and it's also the case. And there are a few rhetorical techniques that are used as well. So, like when you go into their works, you'll notice that there are several times where they just refer to their colleagues who are PhD academics as apologists. And the reason that that's done is because when you refer to various academics or figures as apologists in the atheist community, and this has actually been shown in studies, it automatically takes away from any chances of them being taken seriously. I think that there's a desperate need to refocus that. There has also been the case that if you notice, almost all of the popular mythicists are usually men, usually white guys. It is very seriously the case that people of color are almost never talked about. Raphael Lotchester is one of the only ones out there, and women are almost never talked about. And it's not only the case I'm like virtue signaling here or anything, but it's actually a very real problem from the standpoint that if their works are not being talked about, it's not being evaluated, it's not being fairly discussed. And if it's not being discussed, then they're just being ignored. And I think that's unfair. And a lot of that actually comes from both historicists and mythicists. I'm not like uh, historicists have a lot to do with the way this discourse has gone as well. Maurice Casey's work is extraordinarily um, um, uh, just spiteful of mythicists and people who doubt the historicity of Jesus. And he just regularly lambasts and attacks them and insults them throughout. It is not pretty. He did not contribute positively to the interactions at all. And I think that there's a need to completely reframe this, because I think that basically where it is right now is that this is not necessarily even an academic debate. It is, with the rhetoric and the way it's framed right now, it is a debate between people that don't like Christianity and people that do.
Interesting.
And I think that needs to be reframed. It's not that I'm saying that any of their ideas are wrong. I think that the way that both sides have framed this is bad. And that's part of the reason why I'm wanting to actually, why I've been writing a history of mythicism, is because I want this issue to be taken seriously. I want academics to actually take mythicists seriously, and to take these views and debate these opinions for real. And I think that one of the best ways to do that is that we look at a lot of the works that have come out, and take what's good and treat the rest as a warning. You're not going to have a conducive atmosphere when you act like Richard Carrier, and every single person you don't like you call a hack, a liar, a pseudo scholar, and stuff like that. Or how he does with even other mythicists. He referred to Acharia S as a pseudo intellectual, and he gaslighted her about a lot of stuff too. Like, we very well know that Acharia S was very unfairly treated by most of the mythicist community and the historicists out there, and it was really bad. She was just attacked from all circles. She was attacked in very sexist ways. She was attacked. Her intellect was assaulted. Everything. And in one of his articles on his blog, Richard Carrier was like, "No, it's a myth. You just think people are out to get you." He's like, "No, they were."
I know that she spoke about that for sure. And I know that discourse she had with Dr. Price over time helped. Like, he
Yeah.
was reasoning with her with some of her stuff, like you would agree would be like, whoa, you went off the deep end. But he kind of reeled her back on some of those ideas. And of course, he is a mythicist. So you can only imagine from your view, because this is the thing, we have different views that we're discussing here. Even from your view, even if Dr. Price goes too far and he's too critical, like he doesn't allow certain evidence to even be weighed in it because he says interpolation or whatever, he still reeled her in some. And over time, she shifted some of her views, which I can't imagine. Like, that's why I said earlier, I can't imagine what she would be thinking today with the research. And who knows, she might be like, you know what, Jesus agnosticism, or there might have been a guy or a composite figure or whatever. Who knows where she would be at right now. I've seen the videos of her. I've read a little bit of her, and I would be shocked. I wouldn't be shocked to find her changing her views over and over. We're wrapping up here. So
Yep.
I want to say, I think everything that you said in this is honorable and it's needed. I think anyone can turn around right now from any potential, because I've never had any issues. I'm actually good friends with all sides. I'm good friends with everyone from all sides: historicist, mythicist, agnostic on the position, composite figure, you name it. And I choose to always be friends with everyone because I don't know where I'm going to be at in 5-10 years. And I don't think if I tried, I could read all the books that you've read in the rest of my lifetime. You're very well read. You know the arguments, you've heard this stuff, and just, I wish I could read as well as you. MythVision, I hope, hasn't contributed in a negative way. We've made public the arguments, we've allowed the people to speak and say what they think and why, and I've even entertained some of these theories to believing them. Not saying that I conclude them, but I've entertained them. I'm also bringing in more and more the historicist side, because I'm finding I want to be a balanced show. I'm not mythicist vision, I'm myth vision. And the reason I want to be balanced is because I don't know if I'm right on concluding he's complete myth. I do think there's good reason to believe there was a guy. I don't think that's crazy. In fact, there's a good reason most of the scholars agree with this. And I'm not doing it because a majority. I couldn't care less if 99% of scholarship out there said, well, I believe in a historical Jesus, and let's say 99% of it was Christian. Okay, well, maybe their orthodox position could weigh in their respect of what they think. And I know that this is the polemic, right? They use this and people always bash each other. I'm just making the point, like, consensus isn't the reason why I'm making these decisions. I'm truly trying to figure it out. And I'm thinking there really could be a guy, Chris. I promise you, man. Like, too often the non-religious mythicist act religious in their thinking, and they want to bash the religious when they themselves are dogmatist on the position, not even really entertaining with an open mind. Could there be a guy? No, they're already closed off. They already interpolated everything. Everything's already not good evidence. Everything, like, what if that evidence is potentially good evidence? Or what if we could use that as an argument? So I ask for people to remain open-minded. Everyone who watches this show, I hope, understands that I don't conclude everything that you may believe or think about the matters here. I don't even know some of these things. But that you're not coming at this as a basher either. Like, you love this stuff. You wouldn't have all those books behind you right now. And I can guarantee you those are all topic related to what we're discussing.
Oh yeah, all of these are.
See, you love this stuff, Chris. And I wish we could all get along better and try to find a way to, I don't know, make this, like you said, a more serious discussion and allow this conversation to progress, if that makes sense, with more people not being dogmatic on either side. I bumped into, for example, our good friend Ian Mills. Okay. Ian Mills shocked the crap out of me when I was interviewing him. I said, tell me about the apocalyptic Jesus. And he started to tell me. When the video was done, I was like, how are you a Christian? Right? Like, in my head, I'm like, how are you? He goes, it's my faith. It's subjective. And I'm like, okay, I have respect for that. I just didn't understand how, because all I knew of Christianity, even from Roman Catholic to the other Orthodox positions to me as a Protestant when I was, is that it's like fundamental. Like, there's certain things you cannot allow. Jesus could not have been an apocalyptic preacher who failed. That can't be the case. But he accepts some of these things that scholars are saying, yet he doesn't allow his faith to interfere with his scholarly research. And I respect that. That takes a lot of guts. That takes a lot of honesty, and he has it. So I'm with you on those respects. With that being said, Chris, I'd like to see you come back if you would. I value your friendship, man, and your knowledge, dude. We got to do a show, and I don't necessarily need you to have the answers, right? I love entertaining the theories. All of this information we just discussed on the mythicist arguments and the historicist arguments, I'd like to have a show where you come on and we talk about the probability of various historical Jesuses, if you would, and just talking about them. Like, look, man, no judgment. I don't care who's watching. It doesn't matter. I want to know, like, what you think isn't good and what you think is, and say, well, he was probably a rebel, or no, I don't think he was militant, and here's why. And like, all the various forms of a historical Jesus. I would be like honored to have you join me in discussing that, because you have so many books in your brain. And if we could find a way to download that to mine, I would love to just borrow it and just but would you be willing to do that with me, man?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
I'd love that. And if there's anything else you could think of, like, for future shows in light of your research, like I said, man, I really do value this. And it's been a heck of a 3 hours, 2.5 hours.
Yep.
There's a lot here, and I'm sure you skipped a lot of stuff along the way.
Yeah.
You couldn't, there's no way to exhaustively do this without having a series of 12, 14 hours or something.
Even if I want, like, I'm going to be real, even my book won't be completely exhaustive. If I was to write the most exhaustive history I could of mythicism, it'd just be books upon books wide. I couldn't extrapolate upon every theory, upon how each and every theory evolved, on every single thing in one book. But since it is up, again, I will have a book out in the next year. specifically all over on the history of mythicism. There's a whole there are chapters on it, on the Dutch radicals, on the Soviet Union, on China, on mythicism in China, on the United Kingdom, on France, on United States, and more. So and then on top of that, it's split into three. It's going to be split in three sections. The second section is going to go into common arguments and the current the current trends in academia as in general in regards to them. So
Right.
different archetypal arguments, different like the argument from silence and stuff like that, and then also going into ideological trends, because I'm hoping that my book could also serve as a basis for any sociological studies.
Dude, this is awesome. I love this. Christopher Hansen, thank you for joining me on MythVision podcast, giving us a history of mythicism. And I think, this is just my opinion, I know that the comment section will tell their opinion. I think you did a really good job of trying not to be as biased as possible. I know that you've had encounters in the past where you and Dr. Carrier aren't on the greatest of terms. I know that some of these guys you may not be like best friends with, or you may have differing views from them, but you came across quite respectful, I felt, and you weren't too biased in any way, in my opinion. You could tell you're a historicist, but man, you can learn from everyone. And so I thank you for joining me here. And is there anything you'd like to say before we go?
No, I'm all good.
Well, make sure everybody doesn't forget. If you have already forgotten, how could you? We are MythVision.